The following presentation is intended only for mature audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. Rick Charles presents Avant-Garde. A tremendous guttural cry echoed up and down the coastline as a pair of sail-backed predators quarreled on the beach. Around them, several others looked on with indifference. Such disputes were not an unusual occurrence here. Roughly 95 million years from now, the pharaonic dynasties of ancient Egypt would construct monolithic pyramids in this region. But long before there were pharaohs, pyramids, or the pantheons they honored, there was Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, and the wetland kingdom it ruled. True mangrove trees did not yet exist at this time. Instead, forests of mangrove-like fern trees dominated the coastline, occasionally interrupted by stretches of sedimentary buildup. It was on these pristine sandy beaches that coastal-dwelling spinosaurs formed loose congregations, attracted to the comfortable resting area after long days of hunting along the shoreline. Currently disturbing the peace was a large male that had taken notice of a younger female's catch. The energetic subadult had waded out earlier than the rest of the congregation and caught herself a mid-sized Cretotus longiplicatus. This tiger shark-resemblant fish had swum too close to shore and fallen victim to the Spinosaur's perfected arsenal of angler gear. Spinosaurus was not a terrestrial predator. Its dense bones and stubby hind limbs rendered it cumbersome on land, but in the water it was something between a heron and a crocodile. The tall sail along its back dipped into a flexible tadpole-like fin running the length of its tail, and the dinosaur's flat, webbed feet offered additional propulsion. 3 hooked claws dangled from its muscular forelimbs, ideal for grasping slippery prey. Second only to the sail, by which Spinosaurus would one day be assigned its name, the head at the end of its long, curved neck was the dinosaur's other most recognizable characteristic. It was long and narrow, lined with interlocking conical teeth. Nostrils rested halfway up the skull, from which it would spew ingested salt water like a marine iguana, and the tip of its snout was perforated with sensory organs that could detect movement in murky water. On this primal North African shoreline, the only thing that could challenge a Spinosaurus was another Spinosaurus. The younger female sized herself up against the larger male, stretching 45 feet from the tip of her snout to the end of her tail. She was already longer than an adult Tyrannosaurus rex, but the older male still had at least 5 feet on her. The sexual dimorphism between the two was subtle. Both were decorated in white-spotted black torsos, transitioning into black and white stripes along the tail. Their underbellies and heads were sandy brown. Only the male, however, sported blue rings around his crimson eyes, and a similarly blue crest atop his head. His more intimidating appearance lent him the confidence to attempt bullying the smaller female away from her shark rather than having to wade out and catch his own prey. She was not tolerating it. The female screamed at him from deep in her throat, a raspy cry like a freight train slamming on its brakes and screeching to a halt. Her display was enough to deter the male, who shifted his weight to the right and turned away. He had been looking for an easy meal, and she proved to be more trouble than her meager shark was worth. The other Spinosaurs, still resting nearby, gazed onward as the younger female scooped the shark off the sand and threw it back in her jaws. Her throat pouch expanded to accommodate the fish as it slid down. A feeling of dread suddenly hit the large male like a gust of wind. All of the other Spinosaurs felt it too, as they came to attention and began to glance around nervously. Even the feisty young female became noticeably anxious. It was not a sensation many of these wetland pharaohs had felt in a long time, as very few things in this world could put a mature Spinosaurus on edge. Yet, the male's keen predatory senses had detected an unseen change in the surrounding environment. He scanned the landscape for any indication as to the source of the disturbance, setting off his nerves. He noticed it was becoming difficult to focus on his surroundings. The other Spinosaurs along the beach started blurring together, and the sand underfoot began to glisten, and the nearby mangrove trees became distorted as though observing them through a cloud of steam. The disoriented male took a step forward, and the ground where his webbed feet landed began to burn him, not from the heat, but from the cold. He glanced down to see he had sunk a few inches into white, powdery snow. The male growled with alarm and looked back up to see the landscape had entirely changed. The sandy beach was now a frozen lake. The other Spinosaurs were nowhere to be seen, and rolling hills forested with snow-blanketed trees rose up from the edge of the lake in every direction. Bewilderment set in as the Spinosaurus glanced frantically in every direction. The icy snow continued nipping at his feet. The winter air blasted against his scaly hide, and his anxious breaths escaped as hot steam. He had stepped into some kind of invisible doorway from his tropical beach to a frozen woodland. Although he couldn't possibly have conceptualized what had just happened to him, he knew he wasn't home. Rearing back, the Spinosaurus released a terrified howl that echoed off the surrounding hills. The throaty scream, like metal grating against metal, was a contact call to seek reassurance that he wasn't alone. But from the cold, snowy woodland, his call would not be returned. After a futile attempt to shake off the cold, the distressed male scanned his surroundings more intently. It was then that he noticed something he hadn't before. On the edge of the frozen lake, gray smoke wisped upward from a log cabin nestled among the trees. Even from here he could sense its warmth. The dinosaur's furnace metabolism and heat-retaining immense size was keeping him from succumbing to the cold too quickly. But if he didn't get out of these winter conditions before nightfall, then his survival would truly be tested. With a grunt, the Spinosaurus shifted in the direction of the lakeside cabin and began to lumber forward. As beautiful as it was cold, Michigan's remote Upper Peninsula was a sight to behold in the dead of winter. Surrounded by 3 of North America's 5 Great Lakes, the peninsula suffered inundant lake-effect snowfall that baptized the landscape and all of its inhabitants in heavy quilts of snow. On occasions when the sun did glance through the chronically overcast sky, in its rays the snow glistened like fields of polished diamonds. From inside an old log cabin overlooking Wendigo Lake, Dominique Summers stood quietly sipping her mug of coffee as she admired the frozen landscape. A wall of large windows and a glass door opened up to a balcony encircling the cabin, and beyond that was an unobstructed view of the lake and forested hills around it. With her deep green eyes, naturally caramel-toned skin, and wavy black hair flowing over her shoulders, Dominique herself was just as picturesque as the winter wonderland outside the cabin's windows, but she didn't feel that way. 2 strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind, and a man's clean-shaven face rested against one of her shoulders. Her husband, Brandon Summers' embrace should have felt warm, but to her it felt colder than the frigid air outside. He'd been so perfect when they'd first met in college. He was the blue-eyed, blonde-haired athlete every girl had wanted, and she was the one who got him. Dominique thought about those other girls now. If only they could see the bruises on her body from where he'd hit her, or how many meals she'd skipped from his constant criticism of her weight. He'd become a different man after they got married, and now she only hoped those other girls had found better. "Good morning, Princess," Brandon said. The epithet stung her ears every time he said it, though she knew what was coming if she ignored him. "Morning, babe," she quietly replied. Behind them, still eating breakfast around the fireplace, was Dominique's brother, Brian Cartea, and their childhood best friend, Derek Oliver. They were chatting about something nerdy between bites of waffles, as the mounted head of a white-tailed buck stared down at them from above the fireplace. Brandon lowered his voice so they wouldn't hear him. "I'm sorry about last night," he whispered into Dominique's ear. "I just got a little too drunk." Dominique bit her lip before she said something that would make him angry. "It's okay," was all she finally said. "Yo, Brandon," her younger brother Brian called from the couch. "Where you want to go today?" As loving a brother as he was, Brian was one of those all-brawn, no-brains types. If he were to stand up from the couch, he'd be at least a head taller than everyone else in the room, and his tank top could hardly contain the man's pronounced chest and wide shoulders. His eyes were as green as his sister's, and his hair would have been as luscious as hers too if he didn't keep it shaved down to a buzz cut. Sharing an interest in sports, he and Brandon had grown close, and Brian seemed oblivious to the way his brother-in-law treated Dominique. The four of them had been planning this weekend getaway for months, and had driven out to Derek's grandfather's cabin by snowmobile to spend the weekend riding around the area. "I tell you what," Brandon called back. Dominique flinched from him, unapologetically yelling in her ear. "This lake's got a lot of virgin snow," Brandon continued. "I think we need to tear it up. We can spend a while romping around here and then maybe head into the nearest town for lunch." "Sounds good to me," Brian exclaimed, turning to Derek. "That sound like a plan to you?" Derek simply nodded back as he chewed a mouthful of waffle. Skinny and pale, Derek's comfort zone was less sports and recreation and more keyboard and mouse. But having been a best friend to Dominique and Brian since high school, he would reluctantly agree to their hiking, skiing, or in this case, snowmobiling trips. His brown hair was long and greasy, and his layer of sarcastic humor was so thick it left one to wonder what kind of childhood trauma he was hiding with it. However, Dominique had noticed that he'd been different around them since her marriage to Brandon. His boisterous laughter had become subtle chuckles. He'd foregone his sarcasm for straightforward answers, and he had been worse about keeping up with them lately. Dominique didn't want to admit it to herself, but somewhere in the recesses of her mind, she worried that Derek had developed feelings for her which Brandon got in the way of. She almost pitied the nerdy gamer boy because, even if she hadn't gotten with Brandon, Derek just wasn't her type. Inwardly, Dominique acknowledged that their friend group wasn't what it used to be, and maybe underneath the fist bumps and banter everyone else felt the same way. This weekend getaway was the first time in a while they'd all hung out, and Dominique wondered if, subconsciously, it was a futile attempt to revitalize their companionship. She rolled her eyes, catching herself overthinking again. A distant wail caught everyone's attention. Dominique's body stiffened. Brandon retracted his arms from her waist and looked around the room in dismay. Brian stood to his feet, and Derek took his contemplative gaze off the fireplace. "What the hell was that?" Brian asked. "Shh," Brandon hissed back, listening for the sound to repeat itself. After a moment of silence, Dominique suddenly gasped and pointed out the window. "Guys," she exclaimed, "out there." Brandon approached the window and peered outside. Brian rushed beside him, and even Derek now stood up. Outside, on the middle of Wendigo Lake, was something that had not been there just moments earlier. The four of them watched, speechlessly, trying to determine what they were looking at. Even at this distance, they could tell it was huge, bigger than an elephant. It held itself up on two stubby hind limbs, and a long, paddle-like tail waved behind its sail-backed torso. The creature's nauseating pattern of white spots over an otherwise black and sandy brown body rendered it difficult to make out against the glistening snow, but they could see its narrow, crocodile-like head swiveling at the end of a long, curved neck. Though none of them could believe their eyes, everyone was thinking the same thing. The beast's general form was impossible to misidentify. Anyone who'd ever been to a natural history museum, watched TVs or movies featuring prehistoric animals, or even just played with toys of such a visage growing up could identify what was now standing before them out upon the frozen lake. "Is it just me?" Derek finally spoke up. "Or is that a motherfucking dinosaur?" As if on cue, the motherfucking dinosaur suddenly shifted its weight and began lumbering toward the shoreline in their direction. Brandon sputtered. "I think it's coming this way." "It's definitely coming this way," Brian replied. "What do we do?" Dominique asked with panic in her voice. "How did that thing get there?" Brandon said. "It wasn't there a second ago." "I don't know," Brian answered. "Right now, I don't really care. That thing is coming our way. Hopefully it will just walk by, but we should just stay put and be quiet." "Screw that," Brandon snapped back. "I've seen the movies. That thing looks hungry. We need to get out of here before it reaches us." He grabbed Dominique's arm and started rushing her to the cabin's entryway where their snowmobile gear hung on racks. She yanked away from him. "I'm staying inside," she said. "The hell you are," Brandon roared back. "Get your gear on, hurry." Derek rushed to Dominique's side. "You can't make her go outside. This is a heavy timber cabin. We're better in here anyway." "Shut the fuck up, gamer boy," Brandon cut him off. "You're not her husband. Stay out of this and die here if you want to." Derek hurled a fist at Brandon's face, cracking his nose. Brian now rushed over too as the men began to brawl in the entryway. Dominique screamed for them to stop as Brian yanked Brandon and Derek apart by their hair. His robust muscles handled both of them like toothpicks. "Cut this shit out, you two," Brian scolded. "Derek is right. We're safer in here than anywhere else. It's cold out this morning and those snowmobiles might not even start right away." He then gripped Brandon by the front of his shirt and pulled him closer. "Also, I don't care who you are, don't talk to my sister like that ever again." Brandon pushed himself away and Brian let him go. The ghastly expression that suddenly washed over Brandon's face caused everyone to look behind them at the windowed balcony. An enormous, sandy brown head, patterned with black streaks and blue around the crimson eyes, glared in at them. The pronounced blue crest above its eyes glistened in the morning sunlight. Interlocking conical teeth lined the creature's long, narrow jaws. Stretching longer than a grown man from the tip of its snout to the sockets of its ears, the head was big enough to swallow any one of them whole. After staring at them for several tense moments, the hulking Spinosaurus used its clawed forelimbs to try clambering upon the wooden balcony. The timbers groaned and cracked underneath its weight, and the dinosaur growled uncomfortably. The deep sound reverberated through everyone's chests. "What is it doing?" Brandon whispered. "Trying to get close to the building," Derek suggested. "It must be freezing to death out there and can sense the fireplace's warmth." With a look of resolve, Brandon quickly finished dressing himself up in his snowmobile gear. After slipping the helmet over his head, he turned toward the door, threw it open, and ran outside. "Brandon!" Dominique frantically called after him. Outside, the Spinosaurus cocked its head at the sound of the door squealing open. Its jaws split as the creature released a tremendous guttural wail. Dominique collapsed to the floor as fearful tears streamed from her reddened eyes. Derek bent down and held her hand as he himself began to panic. It was Brian's turn to holler out the door at Brandon as he mounted one of the snowmobiles and violently tugged against the rope start. Still on the other side of the building, the dinosaur turned to walk around the cabin with hefty footfalls in the snow. "Brandon!" Brian yelled. "Get the fuck back in here right now or you're going to die." The Spinosaurus's grotesque head peered around the corner of the building, and Brian stumbled back inside. The sound of the snowmobile's engine revving must have agitated the creature, as with another throaty scream, it thundered forward to swipe at the machine with Brandon still mounting it. One of the enormous claws caught Brandon in the stomach, and tore him open as the Spinosaurus threw him aside. His bloody intestines streaked across the snow like spaghetti as he flailed through the air. The dinosaur showed no interest in his steaming corpse, as hunger was presently the least of its concerns. The misplaced animal was cold, scared, and wanted to go home. In its sauropsid brain, every unfamiliar sight and sound was a threat that needed to be neutralized. Brian crawled over to Dominique and Derek as the creature approached the open doorway and slid its massive head inside. The nostrils, halfway up its skull, flared as the beast sniffed around the entryway. After a moment, the Spinosaurus finally retracted its head and turned to leave. "Brandon," Dominique finally sputtered. "Is he—" She couldn't say it. "He's gone," Brian cried. "Brandon's gone." The three survivors sobbed together as the retreating dinosaur came back into view from the balcony windows. It wandered back down to the frozen lake, seemingly retracing its steps. The Spinosaurus didn't know where to go except back the way it had come. It lumbered across the white expanse until reaching the area it first appeared, at which point all 7 tons of the imposing carnivore inexplicably vanished from sight. Even in her distressed state, Dominique took a mental note of what she just saw. There was something unseen out on that lake that had delivered death to their doorstep and just as suddenly had raptured it back. The first year after Brandon's death was the hardest. The 3 survivors found it hard to heal when their nightmares constantly dragged them back to relive those harrowing moments at the cabin on Wendigo Lake. The first responders hadn't been able to make sense of the Spinosaurus's trackways and could have never believed the truth. So when the trio's survival story made headlines, the Spinosaurus was rewritten as a black bear and no mention was made of the trackways at all. Only the 3 that had been there knew the truth, and it smoldered inside of them until it forged a burning obsession. Dominique was the first to announce her major. It didn't take a scientist to determine that what they'd experienced shouldn't have been possible. Something unnatural had happened that day. Dinosaurs from millions of years in the past didn't simply appear and disappear out of nowhere. A degree in physics was the best way Dominique knew how to approach the overwhelming subject. Derek was right by her side with a major in folklore studies. What they'd experienced that day had opened a Pandora's box as to what was truly possible in the reality they thought they knew. Derek became fascinated by the historical implications of prehistoric animals waltzing into geologically recent times. Brian eventually followed suit as well, pursuing a major in paleontology. While Dominique was obsessed with how the dinosaur had gotten there, and Derek with how frequently this may have occurred throughout history, Brian was more interested in the dinosaur itself and where it came from. There was something about watching a 7-ton predator slaughter one's brother-in-law that commanded a newfound respect for nature's merciless power. It was a sunny August day 5 years after the incident at Wendigo Lake, when the physicist, the folklorist, and the paleontologist sat together at a Chinese buffet putting down steamed rice, lo mein noodles, and sesame chicken. Dominique and Derek had graduated together in January and were now celebrating Brian's graduation, which had just been earlier in the week. Anyone who'd known them 5 years ago wouldn't have recognized either one of them. Always keeping her dark hair in a long ponytail, Dominique's sleek facial features and piercing eyes threatened anyone who met her gaze. Having never missed a day at the gym, her muscled back, toned waist, and skull-crushing thighs lent her an impeccable hourglass physique. She starkly contrasted the petite, malnourished girl she'd been with her late husband. Sitting across the table from her as he always did, Derek could hardly take his eyes off her, and quite frankly, she couldn't take hers off him either. The man's slim, athletic build reflected the cycling and swimming sports he'd taken up, and the curtain hairstyle framing his face called back to the action heroes of early 2000s adventure films. That smile of his made Dominique want to be all over him, but in 5 years, neither of them had made a move on each other. As badly as she wanted him, the very thought of risking the diamond-solid friendship they'd built petrified her. She wondered if he felt the same way. Sitting beside his sister, Brian was as much of a freight train as he'd ever been. But it had been a while since he'd trimmed. He wore his thick black beard and matching man bun with pride. Most prominently, though, his left arm was decorated with a sleeve of paleontology-themed tattoos, including a large Dilophosaurus skull, his favorite dinosaur, across the deltoid muscle region. Every time Brian returned from the buffet with a plate full of food, he used his chopsticks to arrange everything a certain way. The man never missed a detail in his surrounding environment. The sesame chicken had been prepped with more sesame seeds than usual today. He could tell by the way their waitress held herself that it was her first month on the job. Too relaxed to be her first week, but still too anxious to have been here long. Dominique and Derek's unspoken obsession for each other was the worst, though. To Brian, it was as alarmingly obvious as a tornado siren, and he just hoped he wouldn't be unfortunate enough to walk in on them when the funnel touched down. "Did Brian tell you about the new girl he's seeing?" Dominique teased between bites of steamed rice. Derek's eyebrows shot up. "What? No?" "I ain't," Brian laughed nervously. "We're just talking." "What's her name?" Derek asked. "Vanessa," Dominique answered before Brian could respond. "She's into that vampire and werewolf shit." Derek laughed. "That name sounds like someone who'd be into that. You gonna let her suck your blood, bro?" "Shut the fuck up," Brian said with a blush. "She works at the pet store in town," Dominique continued. "She's a reptile girl, apparently." "Vampires, werewolves, and snakes," Derek smirked. "I fucking knew it, bro. You've always had a thing for goths." "She's not," Brian stammered. "She's not goth." Dominique tilted her head and narrowed her eyes. "She absolutely is. Show Derek a picture of her." With a reluctant sigh, Brian reached for his phone and began to sift through it. With anticipation, Derek slurped on his lo mein noodles while he waited. "She literally has red highlights in her hair," Dominique added, "and she wears corsets. She looks like a vampire, in a good way, of course." "She does not," Brian stammered again. She has green highlights right now." He held out his phone for Derek to see, and the man nodded approvingly. The first thing he noticed was the ball python wrapped around her tall neck, pinning down the woman's straight black hair and accompanying green highlights. She held the snake's outstretched tail with one black fingernailed hand. The nail polish complemented her dark red lipstick and sleek eyeliner. A few silver piercings glistened on her right nostril, lower left lip, and left ear. "Wow," Derek grinned. "Not bad." Brian retracted his phone. "What about you, Derek?" he asked wryly. "You got any, recent prospects?" Dominique and Derek both looked down and suddenly became very interested in the food on their plates. "Oh, you know," Derek muttered. "I've just been focusing on myself. I'm sure the right girl will come along when the time is right." An alarm on someone's phone began to buzz, saving everyone from the threat of an awkward silence. "Oh shit," Dominique hissed as she grabbed her phone and silenced the alarm. Brian and Derek came to attention as Dominique examined the data she was receiving on her screen. "Is it the..." Derek began to ask. Dominique looked up at the other two with a stern expression wrinkling her face. "Better hurry up and finish your plates, boys," she said. "We have a hit." A couple of hours later, Dominique, Derek, and Brian jostled in their seats as Dominique navigated an overgrown double-track road in her black Hummer. Low-hanging tree branches scraped against the large red canoe and smaller yellow kayak strapped to the vehicle's roof. After the unbearable bumpy twists and turns, the road finally dead-ended in an all-too-familiar driveway where the Hummer kicked up dust as it skidded to a halt in front of the old log cabin overlooking Wendigo Lake. Swaying pine trees surrounding the cabin betrayed a cool afternoon breeze, and as everyone stepped out of the vehicle, they took in the fresh Northwoods air. Dominique shaded her face underneath a white visor and sporty sunglasses. Her black tank top, tucked into navy green cargo shorts, accentuated her toned chest and shoulders. The brown hiking sandals on her feet squeaked as she slid out of the driver's seat onto the ground. "Hey Brian," she called out, "grab my binoculars from the dashboard, will ya?" Soon, a small container sailed over the Hummer's hood at Dominique and she lurched forward to grab it. "Careful," she exclaimed. "These are expensive." "I trust your reflexes," Brian grinned as he walked around the front of the vehicle. He kept his wavy hair in control under a red bandana, shielding his eyes from the bright afternoon sun with a pair of aviator-style sunglasses. He wore a form-fitting black tank top like his sister, and faded blue jeans tucked into brown rubber boots. Derek stumbled out behind them in flip-flops, board shorts depicting a tropical sunset, and a red t-shirt bearing the sinuous form of a Chinese dragon. "Have you guys seen my sunglasses?" the chaotically dressed man asked. "The polarized ones with the white frames. I can't find them. Fuck, it's bright out here." He used a hand to shield his eyes. Dominique unsheathed her binoculars from their container, tossed the container back into the car, and hung the binoculars around her neck. The trio wandered down to the lake where behind them the cabin's balcony still stood, fractured and bent from where the Spinosaurus had attempted to clamber upon it 5 years ago. The cool afternoon breeze played with Dominique's ponytail as she stepped up and walked out onto a long, weathered dock. Brian and Derek followed close behind her. After removing her sunglasses and tucking them into her cleavage, Dominique lifted the binoculars up to her face and narrowed her gaze as she scanned the surface of the glistening lake. Dominique hummed after a prolonged moment. "I don't see it anywhere." "How long ago did you lose the signal?" Derek asked. "About half an hour ago," Dominique replied. Shortly after Lake Wendigo's ice had melted in the spring, Dominique started a research project collecting data on electromagnetic activity in the area. She had anchored a buoy in the middle of the lake fitted with a solar-powered electromagnetic field probe. The device collected and transmitted data to an app on her phone and alerted her to any unusual spikes in electromagnetic activity. After months of fruitless data collection, Dominique had finally received her first activity spike earlier in the day. However, on their way out to the lake, her phone had lost the probe signal completely, and now the buoy was nowhere to be seen. "Let me have a look," Brian said with a gesture. Dominique sighed and handed him the binoculars. She stepped back as Brian took his turn scanning the lake. Derek spoke up again. "You don't suppose the buoy got..." He paused. "Taken?" Dominique finished. Derek nodded. "It's a possibility," Dominique said with a shrug. "If the buoy simply got dislodged from the anchor, it'd still be floating out there somewhere, but I don't see it anywhere. It's just gone. What about you, Brian? Any luck?" "No buoy," Brian stated. "Have a look at this, though." Brian held binoculars in place as he handed them back to his sister. "What am I looking for?" she said with a frown. "The waves in the middle of the lake," Brian clarified. "Notice anything weird about them, or is it just me?" After gazing through the binoculars for another moment, Dominique started to see it. A large, circular area on the water's surface that seemed to be rippling against the surrounding wave pattern. "Holy shit," she finally exclaimed. "You're right. Good eye, I would have never noticed that." "What is it?" Derek asked. "There's something disturbing the surface of the water out there," Dominique said. "Something we can't see." "What does that mean?" Derek pressed. "It sounds crazy," Dominique replied, "but maybe an invisible portal of some kind? Think of the wind, or maybe an emotion. We can't see those phenomena, but we can see the effect they have on a field of grass or the expression on our face. We're so used to portals in science fiction being entities we can see, but think about it. Something made of energy may not be so readily visible to us. There is a whole spectrum of light and sound waves humans cannot perceive. What if a real portal isn't a rippling blue substance or a ball of glowing shards, but an invisible event horizon one can unwittingly pass through? Such a powerful concentration of energy would surely have an effect on its surrounding environment. Like what we're seeing out there right now, Brian suggested. Derek gazed out across the lake. "So you're telling me," he began, "that there's potentially an active portal out there right now that we could physically pass through?" I would say so, Dominique confirmed. "It's back." The hairs on Derek's neck stood up as the reality of the situation settled upon him. Dominique continued. 5 years ago, my husband was killed by a dinosaur that appeared and disappeared out of nowhere. I'm going to prove to the world that what we experienced wasn't a bear attack." "Are we really going to do this?" Derek asked. "Row out to the event horizon, as you called it, and see what happens?" "I'm not making anyone do this," Dominique said. "Are you guys with me or not?" "Of course I am," Brian replied. "I wasn't saying I'm not," Derek said. "I just wanted to make sure you're serious about this. We don't know exactly what's on the other side of that portal." Dominique shrugged. "That's what we brought the guns for." "I don't think a gun will do much against a Spino whatever," Derek said. "Listen here," Dominique scolded. "If you're getting cold feet, just say it. I'm going to go through that portal and prove that what we experienced was real. You're welcome to stay here and watch." "No," Derek shook his head. "No, I'm with you. I'm with you." "All right then," Dominique said. "Let's go conduct some avant-garde science." A loon's distant trill echoed across Wendigo Lake as Dominique and Brian rowed forward in the red canoe. Gavia emer, the common loon, was a haunting liminal presence in the North Country. Named for its cumbersome locomotion on land, like a penguin, the loon's webbed feet performed best underneath the water's surface. This migratory bird was recognizable for its deep crimson eyes and striking pattern of white spots over an otherwise jet-black coat of feathers. This pattern obscured the bird's silhouette when floating on the surface of the lake, concealing it from predators against the glittering ripples and waves. Few other birds approached the loon's vocal eloquence, its haunting trills and wails an unmistakable accompaniment to the Northwood's summer ambience. A thought occurred to Dominique as she rowed. She clearly remembered the Spinosaurus's color pattern, which the loons actually reminded her of. It made sense that an animal with such a large sail as Spinosaurus would be ornately decorated, almost certainly the result of sexual selection, as with a moose's impressive antlers. The color pattern may have also helped conceal younger Spinosaurs from predators as well. Come to think of it, to Dominique, the Spinosaurus's vocalizations even resembled a deeper, raspier loon. She shivered at the memory of it. It was not a sound she ever wanted to hear again, yet here she was, potentially rowing right into Spinosaurus territory. Beside Dominique and Brian, Derek kept up with them in the yellow kayak. His curtain hairstyle swayed in the breeze over the sunglasses on his face, which he'd managed to find as they had loaded their gear into the watercraft. The load on his kayak was light, with just a few tools and a small pack of bottled water stashed between his legs. Within a waterproof bag was contained his tent and a basic survival kit. Most importantly, his prized machete rested in its sheath on the floor. Dominique and Brian's canoe carried most of the gear, including another tent and 3 sleeping bags, a week's worth of rations with cooking equipment and dishware, a water purifier, everyone's extra clothes, a backpack filled with Dominique's research equipment, and the guns. Dominique had become a firearms enthusiast in recent years, and knowing the potential danger they would face, had come prepared with a tailored selection of guns. The Franchi Spaz 12 combat shotgun was her firearm of choice, banned in several U.S. states for its military designation, but legal in Michigan. Its semi-automatic capability bestowed upon its user devastating firepower, and the shotgun's folding stock offered a flexible range of use. Accompanying the shotgun was a more civilian Colt AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, which Dominique had illegally modded for fully automatic capability. Finally, she had also packed a couple of revolver handguns, which Dominique preferred because they were less prone to jamming than other styles. "I can kinda see it now," Derek announced. "We're getting close." He was pointing out the aberrant circle of ripples on the lake's surface, denoting the general location of the portal. "Brace yourselves," Dominique called out. "This could be a roller coaster." "What do you think it'll feel like?" Brian mused. "Your guess is as good as mine," Dominique said. "That's impossible to gauge since we have no idea what exactly it is or how it works, but considering the high concentration of electromagnetic energy, I wouldn't be surprised if it feels like getting struck by lightning." Goosebumps erupted over Dominique's body, and a sudden feeling of dread overwhelmed her. "Whew," she shuddered. "You guys feel that?" "I feel cold," Derek exclaimed. "What is that?" "It's the energy field," Dominique said. "We're approaching it. This is really—" Dominique got cut off before she could finish her sentence. Derek watched in horror as the red canoe, along with everyone and everything in it, vanished before his eyes. "Fuck," he yelled. Nausea overwhelmed him as his kayak drifted forward, and the next thing Derek knew, he was vomiting over the side of the kayak onto the sand. Only after he wiped the residual bile off his face did he realize that his kayak was now resting on dry sand. The man looked up to see Dominique and Brian nearby, still sitting in the also beached canoe as they gathered their own wits. Dominique inhaled the salty air and looked around to see the wide, sandy beach on which their watercraft had made landfall. Tumultuous waves crashed against the shoreline, and clusters of bizarre mangrove-like trees beyond the beach swayed in the wind. Brian was the first to stumble out onto the sand, having recovered more quickly from the initial shock than the other two. He glanced around in utter dismay at the tropical landscape around them. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Help me up," Derek groaned with outstretched hands. Brian stepped over and helped his friend out of the kayak, after which Derek promptly collapsed to project more vomit onto the sand. "Well," Dominique said as she slowly lifted herself out of the canoe. "That was worse than I expected. I feel like I was just in a plane crash." Derek unclipped his life jacket to unrestrict his heavy breathing, tossed it aside, and sat back in the sand. "Did that actually just happen?" he asked in dismay. Dominique looked over at her brother. "What do you make of it, Brian?" "These mangroves," he observed. "They're not like modern ones. See how their fronds branch out from a single stem? These are not mangrove trees, they are giant ferns. Wakesalia reticulata, if I had to guess?" He turned to face Dominique. "The presence of this flora alone tells me that we are standing in Earth's prehistoric past." Dominique glanced up and down the shoreline to admire the endless stretches of mangrove-like tree ferns surrounding the beach. Their wide fronds and thick, slightly bent stems bore superficial resemblance to modern palm trees. It was like a scene out of a tropical beach calendar. She was so taken aback that she didn't even bother to notice the orange buoy they had lost, resting nearby in the sand. Back by the kayak, Derek finally attempted to stand up. He wobbled to his feet and held out his arms to maintain balance. Brian continued to make observations. "We are in a cove that has enabled sediment to pile up and form this beach. See those small mangrove islands out there? This area is a sheltered inlet." Dominique noticed he said that last part with a concerned tone. "Sheltered?" she asked. "Isn't that a good thing?" Brian shook his head. "Not for us. Sheltered means this is where the local wildlife may tend to congregate. Look at the sand." He pointed to the ground around them. "Look at all these markings in the sand. These are footprints and skid marks. A lot of large animals regularly visit this beach. We shouldn't stay here long." "Acknowledged," Dominique said, "but I can't leave yet. I need to collect data, take notes, and maybe find something to bring back with us so we can prove we were here." "Better hurry up then," Brian replied. Although none of them had any intention of staying long, they had packed as much gear as they did to be prepared for the worst-case scenario of getting stranded on the wrong side of the portal. After discussing a game plan with Brian and Derek, Dominique spent a few minutes digging out the equipment she felt she'd need, particularly her field journal and the shotgun. She quickly jotted down her first entry in the leather-bound notebook, starting with the current date and then the approximate time of day. "Portal confirmed at Wendigo Lake," she wrote. "Invisible to the naked eye, but was pinpointed by its effect on the lake's surface. I successfully passed through it with my colleagues Brian Cartea and Derek Oliver. Passage was violently nauseating. Long-term effects on the human body may have to be assessed. We now appear to be on a tropical beach, and the flora suggests the date." Dominique looked up from her journal. "Hey Brian, any guesses as to when we might be?" "Good question," Brian said as he loaded bullets into the AR-15's magazine. "If I'm correct about these tree ferns, they ranged from the Middle Jurassic to Late Cretaceous. The presence of Spinosaurus narrows it down a little better to the Cenomanian or Turonian epochs, 99 to 93.5 million years ago." Dominique jotted down the provided numbers and continued writing. "This time frame is corroborated by our awareness of Spinosaurus aegyptiacus or a very similar species also being present." Nearby, Derek was fastening his machete's sheath to his right thigh. "No offense," the man said, "but what good will some journal entries do? It's not like anyone will take them seriously." Dominique looked up from her notebook and sighed. "Well, first of all, there's no way we can bring any photo or video footage back because, well, the portal's energy field would almost certainly knock out anything technological." "That's not what I mean," Derek clarified. "And quite frankly, nobody would believe a photo or video either. That stuff is pretty easily faked these days." Dominique nodded. "I know what you mean. That's why ideally we need to bring something back with us that proves we were here. A fresh bone from something that's definitely extinct, or maybe a frond from one of those tree ferns. The field notes are important because once we prove to the world that this phenomenon is real, then our observations will be a valuable point of reference." Dominique returned to her journal and made some final notes further describing their surrounding environment and the weather. Then, after loading her shotgun, she slung it around her shoulder and turned to walk down the beach. Brian followed behind her with the AR-15 in hand, and Derek behind them with one hand resting on his sheathed machete. "Look for anything biological we can take home with us," Dominique instructed. "Something unmistakably prehistoric that can't be faked or written off as modern." The trio each scanned the beach as they walked along the waterline, the warm salt water lapping against their toes. "I see something," Derek finally exclaimed, rushing ahead. Dominique and Brian ran up behind him as he used his machete to dig something out that was half buried in the sand. "It's," Derek stammered. "A dead horseshoe crab," Brian sighed. Dominique stared at the carcass in disappointment. Brian cleared his throat. "By our time, these things will have been around for at least 250 million years maybe, and they barely changed that whole time. This one is almost indistinguishable from modern horseshoe crabs. I don't think it will be of any use to us." "Damn it," Dominique hissed. Nevertheless, she quickly opened her field journal and took note of the find, describing its anatomy and state of decomposition in as much detail as she could. Derek mused aloud while she wrote. "It's surreal how different yet familiar this environment is. The mangrove ferns, there's nothing like it in our time, but these horseshoe crabs look just like the ones we're used to." "Indeed," Brian concurred. "There's probably also lobsters, crabs, snakes, and lizards that bear striking resemblance to their modern counterparts. Honestly, aside from the dinosaurs and mangrove tree ferns, this might as well be Florida." "Hopefully we don't run into any Florida men," Derek quipped. Amid their conversation, by chance, Brian turned to look back at their watercraft and equipment still resting up the beach, and the other two noticed his body suddenly stiffen. Dominique instinctively turned to look in the direction her brother was facing, and for a second it felt like her heart skipped a beat. Derek was the third to look, and when he did, the blood drained from his face. Looming over their watercraft was the harrowingly familiar sight of a long, narrow skull at the end of a sinuous, curved neck, a rotund torso supported on two stubby hind limbs, and a tall, curved sail protruding from the creature's back. Its long, paddle-like tail swayed in the air behind it. The noxious white-spotted black torso, black and white striped tail, and sandy brown head and underbelly were unmistakable. While they hadn't been looking, the massive Spinosaurus must have exited the water and was now inquisitively sniffing their equipment. Despite the predicament they were suddenly in, Dominique quickly recognized that this individual lacked the blue crest and rings around its eyes she remembered on the one that had attacked them 5 years ago, possibly an exhibit of sexual dimorphism, which meant this less flamboyant specimen was female, as tended to be the case in the animal kingdom. "Well, there's your evidence," Brian whispered. "Now what?" Derek asked. "Just be quiet," Dominique hissed back, "and don't move." The curious Spinosaurus shuffled the canoe with her snout, pushing one end of the watercraft across the sand. It was then that she seemed to notice the human shoe prints and tilted her head to observe them. It didn't take long for her to look up and spot the trio standing motionlessly down the beach. Dominique and Brian lifted their guns to rest the stocks firmly against their shoulders. "Get behind us, Derek," Dominique ordered. As he did, the absolute leviathan of a dinosaur shifted her weight and took a step in their direction. The creature sniffed the air to examine their scent, but then stopped to shake her head and snort. Streaks of salt water ejected from her nostrils, and then with a hefty grunt, she continued walking. "Should we fire a warning shot?" Dominique asked. "That might scare it," Brian reasoned. "A top predator like this might be more prone to attacking than fleeing if threatened. Just don't move." Dominique could hear Derek begin to hyperventilate behind them. "This is it," he shuddered. "We're gonna die." "Shut the fuck up, Derek," Dominique snapped back. "If it gets too close, that skull doesn't look too thick. A couple of good rounds into its brain should be able to put it down." "We shouldn't have come here," Derek cried. He turned as if to flee, and Brian whipped around to face him. "Remember Brandon," Brian hissed. "You'll just agitate it if you run. You run, you die. Stand your ground." Derek took a deep breath and nodded reluctantly. They watched as the Spinosaurus lumbered up to them and tilted its head to examine the three little aliens standing on her beach. Full from a successful hunt offshore, the dinosaur was not necessarily interested in whether these creatures were prey, so much as whether they were a threat. She could smell the fear-induced sweat radiating off their bodies. The Spinosaurus nudged the tip of Brian's AR-15 with the end of her snout, pushing him back. As he lost his balance, his finger accidentally squeezed the trigger, and the gun exploded as a bullet sailed into the sky just past the dinosaur's head. She stumbled back in surprise, her footfalls trembling the earth underfoot. With rage, the Spinosaurus fanned out the massive claws on her forelimbs and gaped her jaws to release a tremendous, deafening howl. The shrill, guttural scream shook the humans to their core. They could feel it reverberating in their chests. Fear overcame Brian, and he fired another round at the Leviathan, grazing the skin just below her right eye. The dinosaur lurched forward to grab him, her massive conical teeth snapping around his tattooed left arm and the AR-15. His limb was instantly severed just above the elbow, and blood spewed out as the Spinosaurus lifted her head up with his arm in her jaws. Dominique fired her shotgun, pelting the dinosaur's sternum with buckshot. She fired again and again until the massive beast dropped Brian's arm and took a swipe at her. Dominique flailed backward to avoid the hit and fired another shot into the Leviathan's gaping jaws as they descended on her. The dinosaur recoiled like a snake at the stinging pain. The buckshot had missed anything vital, but it was enough to finally deter the animal. Everyone watched as the Spinosaurus turned to retreat. Hissing in pain, she splashed back into the water and swam away. "Dominique!" Derek screamed. "Your belt!" The woman jumped up, quickly unfastened her belt, and tossed it to her friend. She crawled over to Brian as Derek used the belt to fashion a tourniquet around the injured man's bleeding stump. "He's gonna die," Derek panted. Dominique held her brother's face in her hands. "Stay with us, Brian. We're gonna get you out of here." She and Derek each grabbed one of Brian's shoulders and started dragging him across the sand. "Stay with us," Dominique repeated. When they reached the canoe, she and Derek helped Brian aboard and then took positions on either end of the watercraft to begin tugging it toward the portal. They could only guess where it was, but Dominique felt the dreadful chill as they approached the event horizon. In the next instant, she splashed into the cold, fresh water of Wendigo Lake, sinking to her head. Brian and the canoe appeared right behind her, and Derek behind them. "Swim!" Dominique screamed as she lifted a hand up to grab the front of the canoe. She and Derek paddled furiously toward the distant dock. Adrenaline thrusted them forward as they hauled the canoe across the water. Laying on board, Brian continued to whimper in pain, which reassured Dominique that he was at least still alive. She kicked her legs as hard as she could. It was a long way to the nearest hospital, and every second counted. From the canoe to the dock, from the dock to the car, and from the car to the emergency room, Brian kept his teeth gritted and his breathing steady. Dominique and Derek knew he was tough, and that's the hope they held on to as they waited for the doctors to finish operating on their brother and friend. "I can't lose him," Dominique had said at one point. "My shitty husband was one thing, but I can never forgive myself if I lose my brother." Derek could offer no real consolation. All they could do was wait. A couple days later, they were finally able to visit Brian in his hospital room, laying in bed with his bandaged stump for a left arm. "Here to take me home?" the man asked when he saw his companions. "Not yet," Derek said. "They say you need a few more days to recover." Brian sighed. "I am not looking forward to the hospital, Bill." Dominique sat down in a chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Oh," Brian replied, "pretty good on the pain meds they're giving me." Dominique lowered her gaze. "I am sorry." "No," Brian said. "What are you apologizing for?" "I knew it was going to be dangerous," she replied. "I should have known better than to have dragged us into that portal. I just wanted answers, and I put that above our safety." "Don't do that to yourself," Brian scolded. "We all wanted answers, and knew the risks we would have to take to get them. I would have rather not lost my arm in the process, but it is what it is. Too bad it had to be my tattoo sleeve arm. At least the Dilophosaurus skull is still there, though. I'd be pissed if I lost that one." "We don't even have anything to show for it," Dominique said as tears formed in her eyes. "Not even my field journal. I lost it when we got attacked." "I wouldn't say we have nothing to show for it," Derek disagreed. "After 5 years, we finally have some validation. Who cares if anybody would believe us?" "I suppose," Dominique said. Brian sat up as best he could. "So what now?" Derek shrugged. "Well, it's not like we could live normal lives after what happened to us. I can't just turn my back and pretend this stuff doesn't exist. This is a powerful and mysterious phenomenon we're dealing with. Maybe it was always going to end up with one of us in the hospital like this, if not worse. Sometimes, that's the price we pay for truth." "What are you saying?" Dominique asked. "I've done a lot of research on folklore around the world," Derek continued. "I've developed a hypothesis that these portal phenomena have been occurring throughout history. The Loch Ness Monster, living coelacanths appearing after being absent from the fossil record for the last 60 million years. Once, I even came across an antique globe from the 1500s depicting a brontotheriid, allegedly extinct for at least 34 million years and not discovered by paleontologists until the late 1800s. How is that possible? There is truth out there, and I can't stop now." "I agree," Brian said. "We're sitting on the most significant paradigm shift in the history of the natural sciences. We can't give up now. This was a learning experience. We can be better prepared next time." Dominique frowned. "Are you guys serious?" "Are you not?" Derek asked. We need more resources, Dominique said. Funding, better equipment, maybe a bigger team. All things I was hoping we'd be able to secure if only I'd brought back some hard evidence so that people won't just think we're crazy. Well, we'd better get started then, Brian replied. As soon as I'm out of this hospital, we can plan our next steps. Well, absolutely, Derek agreed. Are you with us, Dominique? She sighed. I suppose you're right. We can't live normal lives knowing what we know. What choice do I really have but to be with you on this? So, of course I am. We're together on this, for better or for worse, to the end if that's what it comes to. You know that. Indeed, Brian said with a nod. Together to the end like we always have been. Derek smirked. Well, it's settled then. After Brian rests up, we'll get back out there and conduct some more... He paused. What was the phrase you used, Dominique? Avant-Garde science, she finished.